Good evening and welcome to the Wednesday night live stream. Drew is again not with us this evening. He is speaking at I guess this would be a summer series now at Decatur Highway. And so you have the blessing of having Mackenzie work with us this evening and myself sitting in Drew's chair, which is as awkward as it felt the last time. I don't know that I'll ever enjoy sitting in this chair.
It suits you well.
It suits Drew better. So as we've been doing throughout our Wednesday night live streams, I do want to go to the shelf over here and maybe pull something off to discuss. And he will probably not appreciate us doing this, but I think it's a good opportunity since he is not here and he is speaking, which means he's not watching at this moment.
Yeah.
So I'm going to pull these stack of books off of the shelf. And, you know, at Ashville Road, we're blessed to have Drew as our minister here, and he's been here. This was his 20th year that he's been with us, and we celebrated that recently. And wonderful speaker, good friend, one of the first people I met when I moved here. He's your brother, so
he's my brother. I know him.
I'm sure you have some stories you could tell us that are very complimentary. But what a lot of people don't know about Drew is on top of being a wonderful minister, a good friend, a good father, he's also an excellent writer. And he does not brag about his writing at all. In fact, he kind of keeps it quiet. Every now and again, he might slip you a book and say, hey, look over this and tell me what you think. But these are the catalog of books that he has written over the last 7 or 8 years, maybe 10 years.
Yeah, I would guess 10.
Most of these, if not all of them, have been published by Riddle Creek Publishing, which is a publishing company that's associated with your dad and mom.
That's right.
And but he has books from from Conquerors to Kings to Christian Hope. His first book, Make Your Stand, which was always one of my favorite cover arts.
That was actually used in the Lads of Leaders material.
Yeah, it really was. But Drew's an excellent writer. I have taught his books. A lot of us have used them for reference on things. And I think sometimes Drew is an extremely humble person and he doesn't like to brag about himself. So I'm going to brag for him. If you need a really good book to teach a class, they're conveniently, most of them are 13 chapters, which just happens to match up with a quarter. But I encourage you to look at his books, read his books. They're excellent. Use them for your classes. And he's going to hate me for saying all of those things. But
you know, Jason, there are more books that have not been published yet. And there's one that I would like to mention.
Okay.
So growing up, the creativity that Drew has always had, he didn't just gain while he was here at Ashville Road.
Oh, so this is not a new thing.
He was like this growing up as well. And I remember, so Drew is six years older than I am. You could probably tell if you look at us.
Really, we can't.
But growing up, he authored a lot of books as well, and he had one book about a man who had gotten into an accident, and the doctors, after this man's accident, the doctors essentially had to rebuild him, and they gave him an iron heart.
Really?
A heart made out of iron, and much like in these situations, he was able to do things like run faster than any other person, lift cars up with his bare hands, things like that. And I don't know, whenever you told me that you were going to talk about Drew's books, I thought, you know, I remember some of Drew's books when I was growing up. And The Man with the Iron Heart, check it out if you get a chance. I don't think it's on Amazon.
Do you have the ISBN number for that book?
I don't. But I do. It has illustrations and everything.
It's interesting. With 20 years of friendship, I've never heard of this book.
Yeah.
So
Man with the Iron Heart.
I will bring that up the next time I see him, I'm sure.
Do that.
I'm sure that it will be a great, very interesting conversation.
I thought you would like that.
Well, it seems that tonight maybe we've started out a little salty, and that's a good thing because our topic tonight is how to stay salty. And you may ask, why in the world are we going to have a discussion on salt tonight? And it comes back to the Sermon on the Mount, which we've been doing this series on. And tonight's passage is from Matthew chapter 5, and it's verse 13. We touched on the second portion of this discussion about disciples,
Yep.
about being the light of the world, but we held off on verse 13 so that we could have a separate discussion on it. So I'm going to read Matthew 5:13. It says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under the foot by men." What's interesting is that Christ in this teaching, he doesn't tell the people that they're going to become the salt or that they represent salt. He tells them that they are the salt of the earth. And when we think about that statement, salt of the earth, we think about really great historical figures. And it's interesting that Christ uses this time to discuss salt of the earth and talking about this group of people. Because if you remember, he's just started his Sermon on the Mount, and he begins it with the Beatitudes. And just listen to the words that he uses to describe the people who are blessed. He calls them poor in spirit, those that mourn, those that are gentle or meek, merciful, pure in heart, peacemakers, those who have been persecuted, those who have been insulted, those who have had things falsely said against them. And when you read the list of these Beatitudes, these blessings, and you think about the words that he uses to describe these people, it's hard to see them as the salt of the earth. You know, I think that his audience then was some of the poorest people. They had followed him into Galilee, and they're not your audience that probably either you or I or any of us would consider the salt of the earth. And yet, here he is, he's referring to them as the salt of the earth.
Yeah, I think that's great, it's an excellent. You have to remind yourself sometimes that this was a sermon, it was a speech, and look at how well organized this conversation is that Jesus has in his Sermon on the Mount. So he goes into initially the Beatitudes, which had to grab everyone's attention immediately, because you think about where Jesus is in his ministry. The Pharisees gathering around and thinking, well, he's going to talk about us, and Jesus completely goes a different direction and talks about the target audience that you just mentioned. And then, speaking of those people, he does exactly what you said, Jason. He talks about how they're salt and how they're light. And then, much like when I last visited you guys, Jesus then begins to talk about the law and fulfillment, and then he introduces things. Yeah. So it's just interesting to see how he sets the stage. He talks about who his big target audience is, and then he labels them as salt and light.
Yep.
And so we're gonna talk about salt tonight, and I think we can probably start out talking about how you can not season enough, and how you can be too salty, and how you deal with things. Salt is not a stranger to the Kaiser household, my household,
or the Poyam household.
My wife loves salt, and I'm not going to say that she oversalts things, because that would be a dangerous thing to say.
Especially broadcasting.
But if she were to do that, we would say that it was too salty, right?
It reminds me of a time, and my brother lived with us for about a 6-month period. This is 19 or 20 years ago. And one night, Cassie and I got home, and he had prepared dinner for us. It was a really nice event. But his green beans, he had cooked with a little too much seasoning. Let's say some Del sauce or something might have made it. They were so salty, we took them and dumped them in the trash can. Yeah. It was one of those where the salt was very conspicuous by its presence. You as soon as you tasted it, you thought, oh no, this is too much salt. So we can have too much of that.
We have to think about things like that. So here's a couple of things to think about as you consider how you season and talk to others about the gospel. First of all, we have to be gentle. So we have to think about how the gospel is to be preached to those who are lost. And a lot of that has to be approached in a very special way. You know, we talk a lot about friendship evangelism, how that's effective today. There's different ways in different cultures that evangelism is effective. In Romans 1:16, the writer talks about not being ashamed of the gospel, and how it is intended for both the Jew and the Greek. So you see kind of an approach of gentleness, and then right after that, we need to think of how we preach the gospel, and that it has to be forceful. So the gospel is to be preached in such a way, and it's communicated as a way to transform people. So Romans 12 verses 1 through 2, very popular passage that talks about the transformation of a person after they've received the gospel. And then right back to gentleness. The gospel is for everyone, but it's also to be presented in a meek way. Galatians 6:1 says it's to be presented in a spirit of gentleness, right? And then one last note that we'll think about as we talk about the ways that we should be careful in how we evangelize is it's a message that does not change. And a lot of people can see that as very forceful, but that has to happen. Matthew 24:35 says, Jesus is speaking and he says, the gospel that I'm giving to you today, the message that I'm giving you today is a message that you will be judged against at the end of time, right? So if it's the same message before, then it is unchanging all the way through to the end. So people struggle with this a lot of times, right? The Gentiles struggled with how to control the message. In Matthew 23:4, verse 4, Jesus is giving the 7 woes, and he talks about the Pharisees and how they tied heavy burdens on people. So you can see kind of the Judaizing teachers would take the law and just bind it on people's backs and drag them down. That's an out of control approach to pushing the message of Jesus.
It's
right?
too salty.
Too salty. That's right. So I thought that might be a good way for us to introduce this idea of how we're salt across the earth. We can be too salty or we can be too gentle. There's a right mixture in all of that.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that he used the example of salt. So salt today to us is the stuff that sits in the little salt shaker on your table, and in our case, sometimes you add a little, and at y'all's house maybe you add a lot by the story you told earlier. But salt to us is not a real valuable commodity. But in Jesus' time, salt was a wonderful commodity. It was used for preservation. It was used for seasoning. It was used for medicinal purposes. In some of the notes that I was reading as we studied for this, our word salary actually comes from a Latin term which referred to payments made to Roman soldiers in salt. So it was even used as a currency.
Barter. Yeah.
And this is a time that is, when we think about being the salt of the earth, to us, salt is just something that sits on our table that we season food with. But it had many extremely valuable uses in Jesus' day, and it still has very valuable uses today. I thought it'd be interesting to talk through maybe some of the properties of salt as we had this discussion. I was reading an article on seasalt.com. Who knew that was a website? But it's a website, and it has all kind of fun facts about salt. But it said that there are over 14,000 uses for salt. Now, I didn't read the whole list, but some of them were for preserving things. Some of them were for seasoning, healing wounds. You can use it in gardening. I mean, there's all these different things that can be done with salt. And Jesus' contemporaries understood that importance. I think one thing that's really interesting about salt is that it's a very noticeable thing. If it's missing from something, you can tell. If there's too much of it, you can tell. Kind of what you were talking about in the introduction. I think about if you take a cup of coffee and you go to pour spoonful of sugar, which I don't know why anyone would put sugar in coffee, but if they did, but they mistakenly put a spoonful of salt, the salt becomes very conspicuous. You cannot miss it. And the same thing if you go to eat mashed potatoes and there is no salt in them, it's a very different taste than what you're used to, and you know it's missing.
Yeah.
So
Such a small thing can, Jesus talks about leaven and its impact on as an agent in whatever it lives inside of.
That's right.
Salt is kind of that same thing. Just a few granules will really impact, food that you eat or whatever it might be. So another thing is kind of interesting to think about the significance. So, Jesus is drawing an analogy to the people and salt. It's just as significant in that time, and probably in our time too. We just, to your point, we just don't notice it as much. But the very next analogy Jesus uses is light. So if you think about, salt is just as powerful as light. That makes it pretty significant.
It really does. And one thing that I read, and I can't remember which commentary it was, but it was talking about how salt and light is something that even the poorest of people could understand, because almost every home had to have some form of light and had to have some form of salt. So it was an impactful thing even to Jesus' audience, who was in a more destitute state.
Yeah.
One other thing that I think salt does that we don't think about a lot of times, but if you've been out running and you've expended and sweated and you've lost a lot of your water out of your body, your salt content goes up inside the body. And the first thing that happens is a reaction to go and look for water. It makes you thirst.
Yeah.
And it's the body trying to regulate itself. And if you've ever eaten a bag of potato chips, not necessarily in one sitting, you probably have gone through a couple of bottles of water while you're doing that, because the salinity, the saltiness of it makes us thirst.
Trying to balance.
And I think there is something there too, as we start talking about being salt as people. We want to be the salt of the world. We want to create a thirst for the gospel. We want to show that it's something that is needed and people want to consume it.
One other thing, and you kind of mentioned it earlier, but I love thinking about the culture during the writing and how significant some of Jesus's examples were. He talked about how salt preserves meat. Well, they didn't have refrigerators back then, right? So they had to have something to use in a common way. So you think about how prevalent and how important just meat is to us in our lives.
Yep.
Same for them, right?
Yep.
Except they didn't go and open the refrigerator door and pull out meat. They had to prepare it, and salt was a significant portion of that. In fact, in Leviticus, whenever it talks about offering meat as part of your offering, one of the requirements, and Leviticus was all about strict requirements and how things should be done. One of the requirements for the meat was that it was to be salted before it was offered. And it just shows, sometimes you step back and you read some of Jesus's words and you think, why did he use salt? It was so important. Without it, life could not happen.
And Jesus taught in parables. He taught in ways that the simple, the uneducated could hear and understand. And salt was something that they understood. I mean, it was a necessity for their life. If they wanted to eat, if they wanted to preserve meat, they had to have it. And it wasn't just for cooking for them. It was so much more important. But then Christ gives this warning at the end of this, and he says, but if salt becomes tasteless, it loses its saltiness. He says it is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under the foot. So he gives a warning in this passage, and we'll talk about it in a little more detail, but he gives, first of all, he says, you are the salt of the earth. But then he says, but if you lose your saltiness, it's going to be a big impact as well. And as Christians, we have to remember that we are salt, and that remaining salty makes us we have to remain active. We have to remain functioning and useful in the church. And we're here to help preserve the words of Christ and the teachings of Christ and the love of Christ. And that's where I see that analogy of preservation coming in. We're here to help preserve the gospel and to spread that and to have others thirst for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about tonight earlier, and I thought I would just this is not fully how I prepared, so I'm not so reckless that this is the only way that I prepare for things. But I thought I would just go out and Google how does salt lose its flavor, right, or something along those lines. Just because I thought that was really interesting to think about salt not being salty.
I Googled the same. We talked about this before. I Googled the same thing today.
Yeah, so evidently it's pretty much impossible because if salt were to ever to be broken down to the point that it could no longer be salty, it wouldn't be salt anymore. That's right. The actual properties that make up salt would not be combined and would not exist at that point. And so I really thought that was pretty significant when you think about Christianity and being salty, right? Christ said this in his own words that only he could create and say in his own way. But you really do, if you get into that state where you lose your saltiness, where you lose your effectiveness, you may call yourself a Christian. You may show up at the right times and do the right things and say the right things as well. But you're no longer salt.
Yeah, right? You may look like salt, but you don't have the properties of salt any longer.
That's right.
I was reading, and I can't remember where I read this, but it was talking about how salt, when we have salt, we have very refined salt. It's purified. Sea salt is taken from where they evaporate seawater and they take out some of the impurities, and you have salt. Well, salt, I think about, you've been to Peru, with Barton. Did y'all ever visit the salt mines where you were there?
No, did not.
Okay, so in the salt mines, we visited there one time. They have these big pools of standing water, and the water would evaporate and leave the salt on the bottom, and they would scrape it and put it in the bottle. The salt in the rawest forms, and it's got a lot of impurities in it as well. And one of the things I was reading was talking about how sometimes people would purchase salt thinking they're getting good salt, and to find out that it was mostly impurity. So it can look like it.
Basically a mixture.
That's right, but it's not going to have that same benefit. And we've got to be careful of that because we live in a world that takes away our saltiness.
Yeah.
I think that the world puts a lot of impurities into our saltiness, and we can lose our influence on the world, our positive influence on the kingdom, by letting worldliness come in and invade us. It's kind of like putting a light under a basket.
Yeah. Another thing we talked about earlier was the actual phrase has lost its savor, and you were talking about what that actually means.
Yeah, it's said that it means it's dull or sluggish. That is the word. I won't try to pronounce it.
That's why I queued you up.
Well, I know, but I don't know that I can pronounce it quite as well as others would pronounce it. But it means that it's dull or sluggish. And you think about that term as Christians and our influence on the world around us. Sometimes we do become very dull and sluggish in how we influence others. And we do it by letting worldliness creep into our lives. We do it by letting our mission here, which is making disciples and following Christ, be diluted by stuff going on around us. And it's easy to let the world just slowly move us in that direction. Sometimes before we realize it's happening.
So our title of our lesson tonight is how to stay salty. So we spent a lot of time describing the properties of salt and kind of the context of what Jesus was talking about and how it fits in the Sermon on the Mount. But I guess we should address the question that is in the title: how do we remain salty? And I think some of the basic things that we usually go to are certainly significant in staying salty, right?
Absolutely.
So, being in a prayerful state at all times,
Mm-hmm.
meaning you're ready to approach God in prayer at any time in your life. Being constantly staying in the Word every day. Those are some things that we can do to stay salty.
And I think one thing that we can do, and it's something that we've talked about in so many of these Wednesday night live streams, is just humble ourselves. Make sure that we're putting God first, that we're putting Christ first, that we're putting our neighbors and those around us before ourselves. And I go back when we start thinking about how do we stay salty, I go back to the descriptions we talked about at the very beginning in the Beatitudes. Be meek, be gentle, be peace-loving. We have to have an attitude of Christ-likeness, and when we start losing that, that's when we lose our saltiness, our influence on the world around us.
One other thing I think about too, and you said this earlier, Christ didn't say, you are like salt, or you should be close to salt, or you should carry salt around with you. He said, you are the salt of the world. So when I think about how we stay salty, well, salt is something that, we talked about it tonight. It's something that you experience, right? It's something that you taste, or something that acts as an agent to protect something else. Well, one way that we can be salty is to have a positive impact on others. So, it's great to read your Bible and be in a prayerful state and do some of the things we're talking about. But if we're not an agent that goes out and other people don't experience us in our salty state,
that's right,
then we can't be salty.
Well, I think about it, the analogy I think of is if you're sitting there at the table and the salt's in the salt shaker, you see that it's salt, but you don't know what it does. You don't know how it influences things until you use it. And sometimes we are very comfortable being known as Christians by word and by our appearance, but when it comes to actually spreading salt and being salty, we fail at that.
Right.
We don't have the deeds that follow the words.
Right.
Is what I think about there. And we have to maintain our influence for Christ. That's the idea of being salty, and Christ warns us that if we don't, that like salt without flavor, we become useless.
Right.
Which is a scary thing to think about. The last thing I can think of to bring up and even talk about this is just the importance of how salt flavors the things around it. It influences the things around it, and our need to make sure that in the communities we live in, we don't necessarily have to go and, like you're talking about in the beginning, use too much salt. But we do need to look at the communities, our workplaces, our relationships outside of church, and see, are we influencing them? Because if we're not influencing them, then we're not salt, because that's what salt does. It changes, it influences, it makes things savory. And we have to ask, are we being influenced by the world, or are we influencing the world? And it goes back to what you mentioned earlier through friendship evangelism. You can't bring someone to Christ if they don't see the influence of Christ in your life, and you're not showing that influence to them.
Right.
So I just think that's a very important part. But I think it's an interesting analogy. It's just one verse. There's not a lot to talk about, but it's a very deep thing to think about. And I appreciate you coming here this evening to talk with us. What I'm going to do is I'll ask you to step off, get Mackenzie out of the picture. We're going to have a prayer, and then when we come back, Tim will join us. If you'll bow with me, please. Dear Father, we thank you so much for the opportunity we have as a church to come together and to study from your word. And though we're having to do it in an unusual circumstance throughout this pandemic, we thank you for the ability that we have to stream a class and study together, even if we're doing it virtually. We thank you for this church. We thank you for the elders and the leaders here that have the vision to make these things happen. We ask that you be with this world, that you help this pandemic go away so that we can gather together again and fellowship with one another and worship you. We ask that you be with Drew as he's away from us speaking tonight, that you keep them safe as they travel back home this evening. We ask that you always guide us and protect us, and it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.